Hello, everyone. I'm Gabriela D'Souza. Welcome to CEDA's live stream Apply Within, Understanding Australia's Job Market, where we will be discussing how the Australian job market has been impacted by protracted and snap lockdowns and closed borders due to the pandemic. I'd like to start today's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. Over here in Hawthorne, in a suburb in Melbourne, that's the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people. And I extend my respect to all elders past, present, and emerging. As we navigate through current conditions, CEDA's program will continue to offer a diverse array of discussion forums, both face-to-face and virtual, to allow people from all corners of the country to participate and to inform and promote debate of critical issues. I might first start with a bit of housekeeping. Today, as at all CEDA events, you will be able to interact with speakers through our Q&A portal, which is available via the link below the video on your screen. Or you can enter in the details by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the passcode apply. There you can post your own questions, vote on the questions by others, and also vote on today's poll question. The results of the poll will be shared at the end of the session. You can also join the conversation on Twitter by using today's hashtag, which is #ApplyWithin. Now, when we first conceived of this event, Australia had recorded 362,500 unfilled positions in Australia, one of the highest number of job vacancies on record. So we had a very different topic in mind. But obviously that seems like a very different world to the one that we're living in now. The lockdowns around the country, particularly in our two biggest states, New South Wales and Victoria, will likely mean a quarter of negative economic growth before the year is out. However, other states are experiencing relative normalcy. But will this be short-lived as Australia plans on opening up to the rest of the world in the next few months? Last year, there was much anticipation about a V-shaped recovery, which eventually came to fruition later on in the year. But it remains to be seen whether or not we'll be as lucky this year. And how resilient will our job market be in the face of uncertainty? And will we see an impact on wages, conditions, migration, and economic growth as a result? To answer these questions and many more of your questions, I'm delighted to present our panel today. We're really lucky to have with us Gareth Ed, Head of Australian Economics, Global Economics and Market at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Welcome, Gareth.
Thank you.
And also we have Joe Masters, Chief Economist, EY Oceania, and Peter Verwer, AO, the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Global Business and Talent Attraction. And of course, I'll be moderating this session. And just another reminder that you can submit those questions at ceda.pigeonhole.at. So I'm going to start this session by asking each of our panelists a question and then opening it up to you, our audience, for some of your questions. First, Gareth, I just wanted to ask you, we've swung back and forth in and out of lockdowns at different times across different states. And as I mentioned in my intro, there's been some talk of a V-shaped recovery at the beginning of the pandemic, and we saw that actually happen for most states. Are you hopeful for a V-shaped recovery this time around, and do you think that will last?
Yeah, look, thanks, and good afternoon to everyone who's on the line. Look, we're in the midst of an extraordinary economic shock at the moment again, in New South Wales and Victoria in particular. I mean, we're in an extended lockdown. It's been going on for a couple of months, and it's got a few more months to go. So without question, we're in an economic shock right now. And we're going to come out of it. And so a lot of people are asking, well, what happens when we come out of it this time around? Bearing in mind that last time when we went through this, we got on top of the health outcomes very early. And with lots of stimulus in the system, the economy bounced back very well. I think when thinking about it this time, it's probably better off, you're probably better off not trying to think about it through the lens of a letter, because any letter probably won't depict what I think is going to happen. Immediately when New South Wales and Victoria exit lockdown, New South Wales probably sometime mid to late October, Victoria a few months after that, we'll get a lift in economic activity. I mean, we have to by virtue of the fact restrictions are eased and people can go back to work and we can see people get out and about and spend more. But the base that we're going to be coming off is very, very low. I think we're looking at a contraction in the September quarter of GDP of around 4.5% based on what the lockdowns are doing. And that'll carry through to partway through the December quarter. And we're probably looking at around 550,000 workers in New South Wales and Victoria currently stood down. So because you've lowered the base so much, the moment you reopen the economy, things pick up and we're going to see the growth rates lift and there'll be an initial feeling that things are pretty good because we're heading in the right direction. I think the question then to ask is how long is it going to take us to get back to the point that we were at just a couple of months ago when, as you said in your opening remarks, we were going to have a talk about skill shortages and how high job vacancies was. I mean, the question is how long does it take the economy to get back to resemble what it basically was at a couple of months ago, which looked very, very good. I think it's going to take us a while. I think directionally we'll be heading the right way, but we've got a big adjustment to come here in Australia. New South Wales and Victoria will go through that adjustment first, but we're going to experience for the first time what it's really like to live with COVID. I think policymakers, governments are still going to keep that objective there of trying to ensure the hospitals don't get overrun. Lots of people are going to be getting COVID. Lots of people are going to be getting sick. And we're going to have restrictions just to make sure that the hospitals aren't overrun. So I think that adjustment process means we don't snap back to what we had overnight. I think it's not probably until the middle of next year that we've kind of adjusted to living with COVID. We're treating it more like anything else. It's just another risk there that we've got to deal with, and then we kind of move on. But, it's going to take Australians a while to get to that place. I think ultimately that means, we have a handbrake then on the economy. There's lots of money sloshing around out there, but until we actually get through that process where we aren't living with COVID restrictions and we're concerned about COVID, then we won't get that full recovery. So I'm thinking about middle of next year when we get to that place.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. And Gareth, for the information of everyone else on this live stream, actually had a really good AFR op-ed about this particular topic as well. So please do look at that. Joe, you recently wrote about how it's going to be tough for the labour market even when we do reach our vaccination threshold. Can you tell us a little bit about why you see that being a problem?
Well, we're seeing it play out right here, right now, actually across Australia. So many people that popped to the supermarket on the weekend may have found that the shelves were somewhat bare, and that was certainly true in my suburb. Now, some of that was to do with some striking around truck drivers and the like, but a lot of that is playing out as just large portions of the workforce that are isolating at home, not just related to restrictions, but people that have COVID or that are close contacts. And we did some work having a closer look at what's happening in the UK, where, of course, they had Freedom Day, they have very few restrictions. And while people are out and about, and we're all seeing on Facebook photos of people holidaying in Spain and Greece, from a business perspective, what they're finding is really elevated workforce disruption. Some businesses in the UK are reporting 20 to 30% of their workforce at any given time are having to isolate either with COVID or as a close contact. And I think that to Gareth's point about what does living with COVID actually look like, one element of that is that your workforce are going to be sick or to have to care for someone who is sick. Now, for some industries where you can work from home, there'll be some softening of that impact because we know that vaccinated people don't get as sick. But for those parts of the economy where you can't work from home, if you think about retail, we think about construction, we think about a cafe, if they've got 30% of their workforce still isolating and quarantining at home, that's really elevated business disruption. And that's just going to mean that the shadow from COVID is longer and bumpier, which is along the lines of what Gareth was just talking about.
Yeah, and we've seen some of that play out with Ozpost as well last week, where about 500 of their workers had to go into isolation because of COVID. I'm still waiting on a package that I asked for last month, but this is kind of the new world, isn't it? Peter, you perhaps have quite a different perspective given your interaction with the global talent visa. What is your impression from prospective migrants and the people who come to you about migrating to Australia? And also tell us a bit about the global talent visa and what it is.
Thanks, Gabriela, and thanks for having me. It's great to be part of the or with the CEDA family today. So this Global Talent Visa and the Global Business and Talent Attraction Task Force is part of the Prime Minister's brain gain strategy. The idea is to make sure that Australia is better positioned in a post-COVID-19 world, in a vaccinated economy. We have, I know CEDA has been very interested and has commented many times about the migration program and the visa program, its strengths, but also opportunities for improvement. And this Global Talent Visa is a reimagining, a complement to the traditional occupation-based visa program. It's not a replacement. It's a complement to it. And the idea is very simply to harvest the world for its brightest minds in this period of disruption, and provide to them the opportunities that exist in Australia, and so that Australia is a country with a clear blueprint for accelerating its capacity, its muscle power in the technologies and sciences and innovations which are creating new sectors, but also, very importantly, transforming existing sectors. Now, to do that, we need to make the most of our homegrown talent, which is fantastic, the alumni from our universities, the many expats that have returned, plus the cream of the world in future-facing industries. So that's what this program is all about. I look forward to answering any questions there. I just mentioned that already nearly 15,000 of these global talent visas have been issued, 15,000. That includes the partners. So if we're looking at the primary global talent visa holder, it's about 6,500 of some of the world's best thinkers in mRNA technology and rocketry and satellite and ag tech and fintech, many in the medtech area, hydrogen, defense, quantum computing, where we're already strong. So we're bringing in the best of the world, adding them to our existing pools of talent and giving us this acceleration opportunity, which is we've seen that if we look through the COVID period, we're going to need this extra firepower and muscle power in order to turbocharge the economy and get back on track for what's happened during the COVID-19 disrupted period.
Yeah, that's great. Clearly a lot of interest in that particular visa, which is great to see. I'm going to go back to Gareth, but also just wanted to make a note to the audience that you can ask your questions on Pigeonhole and I'll pick them up and put them to our speakers. But coming back to you, Gareth, for a second, what is the impact of a lack of full participation in the labour market going to have on that overall level of output and GDP in your view? How detrimental is this going to be for our longer term growth?
Well, look, it's probably worth keeping in mind that the participation rate here in Australia actually hit a record high only a few months ago before we went into these recent lockdowns. So, there was really healthy signs in the labour market. You can put that probably down to the fact that COVID wasn't a problem and no one was actually concerned about getting it by turning up to work. And then the other thing was there were great opportunities available for people because the economy was doing well. We had an above average level of job vacancies in every single industry in Australia. And so that's obviously a great situation for a worker negotiating a job coming in. I think this time around, though, it's going to be a little bit different because I think there's going to be a material proportion of people out there who are concerned about getting COVID. Those concerns will dissipate over time, but I think this is so unknown for us here in Australia, I think there's an adjustment process to go through. 80% of people will be vaccinated, of adults, but if you flip that around, it means that 20% of people won't be. That's a decent chunk of people. Hopefully that number goes up in terms of the number of people vaccinated. But a lot of people, won't be vaccinated. They might be concerned about catching COVID. You'll have people who are vaccinated, but they don't want to catch it because they're worried about passing it on to their children. As I said, I think those concerns will dissipate over time. But what it'll probably mean initially, and I'm sort of thinking here the end of this year coming into early next year, is that participation rate is not going to be back up at those levels that it was only a few months ago. that ultimately is then going to weigh on the labour market and weigh on GDP and the economy. I mean, we can see that disruption overseas, and I think that's where it's really handy to get a sense of what might happen here is to look at the overseas experience. And in the United States, for example, they're still struggling in various parts of the country to get participation up to kind of levels that it was at pre-COVID, just by virtue of the fact COVID is there, and a lot of people, as I said, are concerned about getting it. We'll have to see how all this plays out. I think in the medium term, though, it's not going to be a problem. It's just that adjustment process, which I think has a fair way to run.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point of view, I think, and goes to the kind of participation question, Joe, that we spoke about around how the effects of the pandemic have been felt kind of unequally amongst different people. So we know that there's been an unexpected gender hit. So did you want to speak a little bit about that, about how the pandemic has affected employment shares and participation shares differently amongst men and women?
Well, I think one of the key aspects of the pandemic has been the unevenness, not just across genders, but across age cohorts, across regional areas, across different parts of the state and across different sectors. And that's one of the most tricky sort of issues, I guess, that we face as economists, is that we often talk about, the national average, or, the housing prices, for example. So that unevenness has been very prevalent, and it will be very prevalent on the way out. Look, one of the interesting things is we know that when we close down, it hits sectors of the economy that have higher proportion of their workforce are female, are young, and are casual. Obviously, last year when we were hit by the pandemic in the initial round, if you think about that JobKeeper 1.0, it didn't quite capture all those people, the big debate around casuals, for example. This time around, we're obviously putting money straight into the hands of workers, defined by the number of lost hours. So we're probably hitting people a little bit better and supporting them a little bit better. I think the most surprising thing, though, was as we emerged from lockdown, is we had a real snapback in employment of women. So they took a really big hit up front, and then they came storming back in employment, but also in participation, which hit a record high, as Gareth said. But that record high was really driven by female participation. And interestingly, the sort of cohort that has struggled to regain employment is full-time male employment. So I guess that tells us two things. One is the jobs that we've created in the rebound are not the same as the jobs that we lost. And the other thing is that we need to be careful when we're looking at this unevenness, that we don't just look at a point in time, and that we look at sort of the overall impact and the cycle, and we make sure that we're supporting people in the moment, but we're also doing the right things to support those that might be left behind sort of in that longer term. And at the end of the day, we want a jobs-rich recovery. People feel economic crisis through the labour market. They may lose their job. The person they rely on may lose their job. Their neighbour may lose their job, which makes them feel uncertain and not wanting to get out and about and spend in the economy. So having a keen focus on jobs is the right one by the government.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised JobKeeper, because obviously that is one of the key supports that's been available. In your opinion, with Job Trainer, Job Maker, can't remember all of the ones that we've had, but do any of those, do you think, do the job in terms of bridging where we are currently to where we want to be?
I think, in fairness, Australia did a magnificent job. Look, we built a bridge to the other side, and that bridge wasn't perfect, but it certainly did its job. And, if I think back to your opening remarks, we can see that. We saw that V-shaped recovery. We didn't see the U, we didn't see the L. So we absolutely did do that job. And I think it's really important to not forget that those policies were put in place incredibly quickly, for the first point, but also at a time when we just did not know what was happening, literally from a health perspective, from an economic perspective. So I think when we look back, we need to remember the time that those policies were put in place, and I think they built a really good bridge. There is some fascinating new research out of the OECD a couple of weeks ago that looked at JobKeeper in particular and found that in the first round of JobKeeper, it protected all firms, including highly productive firms. By the third iteration of JobKeeper, it was really keeping alive less productive firms. So it does reaffirm what economics tells you, which is, you know, in the first instance, in the depth of the crisis, you want to respond and you want to protect everyone. But at some point, you need to be more targeted and allow for that creative destruction to occur. And we haven't got there yet. And I think that's a key challenge with JobSaver, which is what we've got at the moment, is when is the right time to wind that support down? And that's always a really difficult question, but it will be even more difficult because the shadow of Delta will be so long and so bumpy.
Yeah, and I just want to bring in Gareth on this as well. You know, Jo in her comments made the distinction between how we had JobKeeper last time and how we have a much more direct support mechanism in terms of just funneling money into people's bank accounts. What do you think the relative merits of having done that is, and how do you think that helps us in the recovery?
Well, the beauty of working for a big bank at Commonwealth Bank is we've got lots of access to internal data, so we can actually track what's going on in terms of income going into households at the moment, and we can monitor really how compensated or not those workers that are stood down are from the government payments. And I've got to say, it looks pretty good at an aggregate level. You know, when we look at our data on what's going to CBA bank accounts in the form of wages and salaries and government payments, we've actually seen a slight tick up in the last 6 weeks or so in terms of total income going into CBA bank accounts. So it's a little bit like what we saw last time, as in last year. And what it means is that at an aggregate level, the government is offsetting the lost income that workers are foregoing by not actually working. And you know, look, that's not going to be the case for every single person that's currently not working. There'll be people that are on more money than what the government's giving them. But equally, there's some people that will have found they've ended up with more money as a result of not working. It's very hard to calibrate these things perfectly, but I would say that the level of support right now is good. And it suggests to me that when we come out of this, the rebound that we can get in the economy is not going to be negatively impacted by the amount of money that's sitting out there. The reality is that household savings have actually been going up right through the pandemic because we've been spending less, and you know, income's been well cushioned by the government. So I think on that front, the government has done a good job, and you know, the spending rebound we get from here is not going to be negatively impacted by by damage to household balance sheets through the actual shock. I think what will weigh on spending is just the health situation itself, the restrictions that I think we're still going to have imposed because of that objective to make sure the hospitals aren't overrun for a while. And then also at the margin, you know, a reduced appetite for some households just to put themselves in the way of getting COVID, which will weigh on the services side. But I would say overall, the compensation here in Australia for people that have been impacted by the pandemic has been pretty good. And that was the key reason why the economy actually snapped back so quickly last time around.
Yeah, I do have to say that although my savings has been boosted, I've been spending a lot of my savings on what I call wellness spending. So candles and teas and chocolate and all of those treats just to keep ourselves going. Obviously in Victoria, this is our 6th lockdown. So, you know, whatever keeps you going. But I wanted to bring in Peter on some of the, you know, we've been talking a little bit about that bridge to the other side and what that looks like. And you mentioned in, you know, your first set of comments about how Australia, through the Global Talent Program, is able to tap into that talent overseas. And I just want to get an understanding from you about how you see that kind of playing out in terms of Australian businesses and that, you know, argument around human capital just being so important, being able to interact with that global human capital and being able to bring that expertise here. I'd just like you to comment a little bit on that.
Thanks for that. And thanks, Jo, for that phrase, building a bridge to the other side. I'm going to steal that one and add to it because if we look at businesses and talent overseas looking into Australia, it's quite a different impression from our view looking out or making judgments about ourselves. I speak to many, many businesses and many of the individuals, the people who've received these global talent visas, and I ask them all of the time, you know, what's the attraction of Australia? And firstly, they see the way that we responded as a nation to COVID-19 as an X-ray on not just government leadership and policy, but the community's response. I mean, we did very well compared to other countries, not just in terms of the brute statistics of death rates and hospitalizations, but an economy which has held up quite well. I mean, there are going to be challenges, as Gareth has mentioned, but they look in and they say, here's a country that has its act together, but their real question is always, does the country have a blueprint for growth? Does it have a clear idea of where it wants to go? And this is where somebody who's deciding, should I risk capital? Should I risk my family and my future in coming to Australia? Should I set up a business in Australia? Does a lot of homework. And they say, here is a nation that has looked at what it's done in the last 30 years, recognised it was running out of puff in terms of the microeconomic reform strategies and all of those recalibrations of our policy framework, which worked for so long, and then used COVID to say, you know what? We want a better quality economy. We want a more resilient economy. We want to make things again. And they look at policies like the modern manufacturing strategy, which is a renaissance of manufacturing in Australia, designed specifically to build our resilience and sovereign independence. They look at the space economy that we want to build, the work that's being done in ag tech, the health and life sciences, the 100+ precincts that exist in Australia, the transition to a new energy economy, which from the inside it looks like Australia is a laggard, and people have many views about that and what sort of signals we should send. But in terms of the technologies and sciences and the businesses that exist here in hydrogen and solar and whatever, people from the outside just see opportunity. And so that's a long answer to your question, which is the world sees Australia as a country which is going to transform its fantastic existing strengths in resources, in agriculture, in the services sector, financial markets, but also set out very strategically in a way that when I look at the countries that have really got this right, Singapore, Israel, Ireland, the Netherlands, more recently Canada, we are matching them policy for policy. And we can talk about some of the downsides in a second, if you like, if you think it's relevant to this migration debate, because, there are myths to be busted about Australia. There are views about tax and, is Australia a country that encourages innovation and science and collaboration between researchers and industry? But the view from the outside is that things are far more positive than many people would suspect if we just read all of the local commentary. And that is why Australia is a magnet for talent, and there are many of the world's most successful pioneering industries that are talking with us and our colleagues at the states and territories, because they want to diversify their operation to this country.
Yeah, we'll definitely come to that in a second, especially that global competitiveness aspect. But I wanted to come back to Joe for a second. You talked a little bit about that workforce issue and the TTI requirements around people who are infected. We had a question about how do we mitigate workforce disruption living with COVID if, similar to the UK, we experienced 20% of our workforce isolating. And I'm hoping at some point we'll get to rapid antigen testing, but I will leave that discussion up to wherever you want to take it.
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. It's a really good one. The reality is, if you are a small business and you can't work from home and you have 20% of your workforce unable to come to work, that's incredibly difficult to mitigate, particularly given the risk that 20% of your workforce that can't come to work are all off one shift or all from one factory or all from one logistics portal or one supermarket. So we are hearing, for example, around Australian supermarkets, an attempt to try to pull on their national network to try and solve these problems. But, that's just really, really difficult. I will touch on rapid antigen testing. Look, I'm an economist. I'm not a scientist. I've learned a lot about science in the last 18 months or so. Rapid antigen testing absolutely has its place and it can be helpful. But we do need to remember that it's not as straightforward as perhaps it sounds. So, for example, in Australia, we require a medical professional to oversee the use of antigen testing. So that's difficult. It's expensive. So that's less of an issue for the big end of town, but for smaller, medium-sized enterprises, that's a cost that they just may not be able to wear. In Australia at the moment, you can't get the tests, actually. So unless you've already ordered your supply, that's a problem. And also there's different types of testing. Some of them still use a nasal swab, which, as I understand it, if you're being asked to do that every day, is a pretty uncomfortable and unpleasant experience. As I said, I'm not a scientist. So I think that as we move through the next 12 months, the sort of timeframe that Gareth talked about, as we learn to live with COVID, things will get easier, but they're still going to be different from what we experienced in the past. My guess, for example, if we look at what's happening in the UK, is that over time, you won't have to quarantine for 10 days. You'll quarantine for a shorter period, particularly if you're a close contact. You'll quarantine until you can produce a negative test. Even if you have symptoms, we might be able to shorten that quarantine period. We might get better at treating COVID. At the moment, the focus is all around, of course, vaccination, incredibly important, undoubtedly the path out. But if we can learn to treat COVID better, then that will free things up as well. And look, the expectation is that eventually it causes the same disruption as something like influenza. But getting to that point, I think we just need to be realistic. That doesn't happen just because you hit 80% vaccination. That is years before we get to that sort of point. So I really believe that Australian businesses need to prepare for elevated business disruption.
Yeah, throwing it to you, Gareth. What struck me as well with this whole rapid antigen testing, I'm a millennial, so I'm probably just incredibly impatient, but it seems to me so bizarre that, we've taken so long to adopt stuff that's been kind of commonplace in other countries for a while. I know that in Walgreens, you could just pick up a rapid antigen test as a consumer. I just want your thoughts on how you see that kind of mechanism playing out here. And also, if you're willing to talk about it, just, why we've kind of been so slow on the uptick.
Oh, look, I don't have an answer there. I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about this sort of stuff. I mean, I'm sort of thinking about the economy more than that sort of micro detail. I would just sort of make the broader observation that before we get too down on ourselves with how we've handled all this, I mean, we did an incredible job for a long period of time of effectively keeping the country at COVID zero, which meant we had a really good, economic rebound. We've talked at length now about this V-shaped recovery, but the contact tracing that was set up here in New South Wales, for example, was remarkable. I mean, over Christmas, if you recall, there was an outbreak of cases on the northern beaches, and we never went into a mass lockdown. The government was able to get on top of it, and cases went back down and things reopened. So I think by and large, the way we've handled COVID has been very good. It's probably just only been recently where finally we've actually been up against something that got the better of us in Delta, that we've sort of questioned our whole response to it. But we can't forget that, and as Peter said, the metrics, the hard metrics on deaths and the like have been very good. The hospitals are not overrun yet. Economic outcomes have been pretty good. So I don't want to get on the case of policymakers around, testing and whatnot right now when the response has been pretty good. But to Joe's broader point, though, I mean, we do have a big adjustment to go through, but in a lot of ways we just need to meet it head on because we can't avoid it. The rest of the world's gone through it. We're late to the party in some sense, but that's because of our relative success. And I think once things reopen and we've all got it in our mindset that this is the way that we do life now, we'll find that I think Australians will be pretty quick to embrace the new environment. And I think that we'll get on top of this, not too long, as long as we're just sort of cognizant that it doesn't go back to what it was. If we get that in our mindset, we change our expectations, and I think we move forward pretty well by and large.
That's a great and optimistic case. I love it. I'm probably very realist. There's a question coming in from our Pigeonhole about there's a considerable amount of casual workforce that are reducing their availability to work so that they can get disaster payments, even though there is work available. To the panel, any insights for employers that are struggling for labour? Joe, do you want to have a go?
Yeah. Look, we know that it's happening, and I think Gareth made the point before. It's very hard to match your disaster payments for kind of each and every situation, and there's a wide range of situations. So we do know that there are some typically, not entirely, but typically younger Australians, casuals, that are earning more on COVID disaster payment than they would do. The classic example would be a tertiary student that maybe scraped over the 20 hours that's now getting a $750 payment. Look, from a business perspective, if I think about it, and it's partly economics, but not entirely. I mean, I guess if you think about it from the person's point of view, the rational decision is if I can earn more money not going to work, then I'm not going to go to work. So, one thing I think about is you've got this pool of sort of workers that aren't coming into the office, into your store, for example. Suddenly you need some of them to do that. Can you find a way to offer a smaller portion of your workforce enough hours that they can earn more money than the government support payment? I know I've heard of one example of a store that went out to a wide range of workers and said, who would like to come back to work? We've got this many hours and we'll guarantee you this many hours. Now, for some, that may not be worth it, but for others, it will. And I guess the other point I would make is that this disaster payment won't last forever. We will emerge from lockdown, and when we do, we will reduce that government support. We have to, for lots of reasons. We want to get the economy back firing, but also because it's incredibly expensive. And at that point, that workforce should be available.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting looking at it from the employee's perspective, because obviously this is not a situation that's just confronting us. I know the US has also had a lot of staffing issues lately, and some of the reasons that are cited are because of those payments. But obviously, great to note that, obviously those payments won't last into the future or into the long term. I have a question from Paul from the audience about the global talent visa, but also the shortfall in lower skilled workers and student visas and holiday visas and migrants. And how will living with COVID help to bring some of these workers back?
Well, I can really only talk about the global talent visa, but I might mention that there's also, before I said visas are like apps. So are these apps fit for purpose? The global talent visa is attractive because it offers permanent residence for the individual and their partner, and that makes us very competitive with, say, a Singapore Tech Pass and other visa arrangements in, say, Canada or the UK that offer a pathway to permanent residence. But another visa app of the moment is a beachhead visa, a 408 visa, whereby if there was a firm that was going to move into Australia, that was going to employ Australians. That's the key here. It's not just about FDI. The firm sets up shop in Australia, co-invests with Australians, employs Australians. It's part of builds an Australian supply chain. Then we can get them in. We can process them as a job lot. And so this has not been done before. So this is a specific response to the times. I think that there have been several changes that have been announced by the Minister for Immigration and Citizenship that are dealing with students and dealing with agriculture workers all of which are recognising the value of those individuals to the economy. But I can't speak to that specifically.
Fair enough. There's another question around labour shortages. So obviously we've talked a little bit about, or we've referenced a little bit about how there's a bit of a two-speed economy at the moment with, the economies that are in lockdown are obviously not doing so well. New South Wales, Victoria, the ACT as well. But, there are other parts of the country like WA and Queensland who are going gangbusters. I know one of the issues that comes up a lot in Perth is around interstate mobility and how that's impacting their workforce as well. Jared, I can see you nodding, and nodding means that the moderator is going to ask you to comment on that. So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Look, I was really nodding because I find it, in a sense, ironic that people in Western Australia are complaining about lack of interstate migration, given the decisions made around the border with WA in particular. We know that when we close borders, domestic or international, it has a immediate and very clear impact on the economy and on the labour market, and those two are obviously connected. Hopefully, we will see all states get behind the National Recovery Program. Obviously, we've got vaccination rates that have accelerated substantially in New South Wales. In fact, vaccination rates in New South Wales are now up amongst the world's best, the world's fastest. But we are still seeing those vaccination rates in those states that are living largely without the Delta variant still lagging behind. And part of that national plan is not just for a given state to get to 80% vaccination, but to open domestic borders, we need the national average to be that high. So, I think if you are struggling because domestic borders are closed and you can't get that interstate migration, and WA obviously a big user of FIFO workers, then I would have thought there was an imperative there to get your vaccination rates up so we can get the national average to 80%, which is really what the national recovery phase was about. But I suspect also politically is just what's needed to open up those borders that have been tighter than some of the other ones in the country. I think maybe I'll just raise another point, which looks a little bit beyond COVID. Australians historically have not actually been that mobile. Like if we compare to the US, right, we typically don't up and move cities for a job. And I do wonder whether that's, we talk about business dynamism, we talk about productivity growth, we talk about trying to drive our unemployment rate down. So we need better geographic matching of where our jobs and our people are. I'll just put it out there, sort of what policies can governments of all levels put in place to try to make moving easier. So I haven't spent a huge amount of time thinking about this, but, there's a lot of differences in states. We have different education systems. It's really hard to move my child. We use different handwriting. I think there is a broader conversation there, and we are seeing a bit of momentum at the moment, for example, into Queensland. Traditionally, we've always had a strong outflow from New South Wales, but we're seeing this really strong outflow from Victoria into Queensland. How can we just make people more mobile?
And that also goes to, occupational licensing and all the things that make work difficult.
Can I just jump in and say something there? Just to raise another point that's worth thinking about. There are different competing objectives here in terms of skill shortages in the labour market and what people want to see. I mean, clearly a business that wants to fill a position wants a big pool of labour of which they can recruit from. But the Reserve Bank of Australia wants to see some friction in the labour market so that they can so we get some higher wages outcomes. That's been a challenge for many years now, where we've had an excess supply of labour in the workforce, and we've had pretty soft wages outcomes, around that 2% mark. And that has meant the Reserve Bank hasn't been able to meet their inflation target. So while we don't want the balance to get too out of whack between the supply and demand for labour, we do need some pockets of shortages to emerge so that wages pressures start to come through. That in turn should lift wages expectations. And then we can be on a kind of path where 3% wages growth, for example, becomes the new normal as opposed to 2%. And we're still well away from that at the moment. So I just kind of say that there are different objectives at play here. And I think it's going to be really interesting when the international borders reopen, call it the middle of next year. I mean, we'll find out more along the way when that's going to happen. But just what actually we see in terms of net overseas migration and how quickly or not that comes back to the levels that we had pre-COVID, because it's going to prove very challenging if the central bank ever wants to sustainably meet its inflation target. If we're constantly filling any skill shortages we get with people before we actually see wages growth pick up. So I think it's a really interesting space. That's kind of a separate issue to the interstate borders. But as we go along, we'll have to ask the question of, as a nation, do we really want wages growth to accelerate such that inflation goes up and then interest rates go up, or do we prefer what we had before, which is pretty strong growth in labour supply, strong population growth, and that kind of generates more muted wages and inflation outcomes.
Yeah, I guess, one point that comes to mind is that if, 18 months of no migration didn't do it for our wage increase, if that's what we believe the mechanism is in terms of wage increases, then, what will?
Well, it threw my forecast out the window. I thought we were going to see wages step up quite a bit in Q2, which is the latest print we got. And, the official data said there wasn't much happening there. I've never spoken to so many businesses that said that wages pressures were there. Some of the business surveys, NAB business survey, for example, and the PMIs indicated that input costs were rising and wages are a big component of that. But it just wasn't in the official data. And maybe it means the labour market just has to get, even tighter than what we had just a few months ago for wages pressures to come through. Ideally, we want a bit of everything. We want to make sure that we don't have too many skill shortages. We want to make sure the economy is growing at a good clip, and we want to make sure that wages growth is running up around 3%. It's hard to get it all happening at the same time, but I do think if wages expectations lift, that'll get us partway there. And the problem is that we're sort of been so used to now 2% being normal that it's harder then to get it up to that level where we normalise 3% again.
Yeah. Now that we've been talking about the RBA and inflation, I guess now is a good time to just discuss what this means in terms of, we've had a lot of stimulus spending and we've seen the RBA exploring their taper. Just trying to get the view from the panelists about, what is that? We had previously budgets that we wanted to put back in black, and we were very conscious of that fiscal deficit. Where does that leave our budget conversation at the moment? Obviously noting that JobKeeper was 100% the right thing to do, and putting supports in there to make sure that people stayed attached to the labour market was the right call. But where does that kind of leave our fiscal management policies?
Look, I'm happy to jump in there to say that it was only, pre-COVID that I would say that the government here kind of thought about a budget balance, a budget imbalance as kind of a measure of economic success, whereas, right now that's clearly been abandoned and the government is just very much focused on economic outcomes, and the budget is a question for another day. But we do absolutely have to answer that question. As I wrote in a note in the AFR a few days ago, if the size of the deficit doesn't matter, then why are we still paying tax? But if the size of the deficit does matter, then at what point, do we have to look at what we're doing and say we can't keep going down that road? I think come in the middle of next year when things start to normalise, we have to have that conversation as a country. If you look at what the government put out in the May budget this year, they're expecting, or they had forecast expenditure to be significantly higher as a share of GDP for the next 3 or 4 years compared to pre-COVID. So they've shown their hand that they're willing to run pretty sizey deficits even when we get beyond the kind of COVID interruptions. And that's quite a departure from what we had pre-COVID. To tie it into the Reserve Bank, we're in a kind of fascinating place where the Reserve Bank is basically printing money through quantitative easing. They're buying an extraordinary amount of government bonds, and the government is issuing a hell of a lot of debt to pay for all of this. So we're in a new paradigm. We're not alone. There's a number of countries around the world going through the same thing. But I think we're heading down the direction where the government is going to take a far greater role in terms of demand management in the economy, and they'll probably end up being more willing to drive the budget or use the budget rather to drive the economy. And I don't think we're going to see any kind of pursuit of a surplus anytime soon. I just don't think it's on the horizon at the moment.
I like that phrase, use the budget to drive the economy. Joe, did you have any thoughts about that as well?
Sure. We're all Keynesians now, right? So I agree with everything Gareth said. Maybe I'll just add a couple of things. We have almost doubled our government debt, which is extraordinary, and we don't seem to be worried about it. To be fair, these are extraordinary times. But we do compete globally for capital to fund that. And our government debt levels are still about half of the average of the G20 and expected to remain around there. We remain one of 10 or 11 AAA rated economies. We're not having any trouble issuing the increased bond issuance, including with strong demand from offshore. So we do need to address our debt issue, but this sort of ability to issue that debt at the moment is buying us time, as is our debt servicing cost. So for some years, for the next few years at least, we will have economic growth rates that are faster than our average interest rate. It doesn't solve your problem, but it does buy you time to work that out. I think Gareth's absolutely right, though. I think we need a national conversation about what are our community expectations and how do we fund that? Because you've got this COVID shock, but on top of that, we've got the demographic challenges on our budget as well. We think about the projections in the intergenerational report around aged care, healthcare, the blowout in the NDIS. Now, maybe there's a bit of cost constraint that can happen in there and slightly better targeted support and those sort of things. But when you look at the demographic challenges and you look at what Australians expect, I would think that the cap on tax revenue at 23.9% of GDP has to come under pressure. And as that comes under pressure, we have to have the conversation that we've been having for 20 years, which is what is the right tax mix. To some extent, I feel exhausted talking about it because, I'll put it out there. Find me an economist that doesn't think we should have a higher GST rate and a wider coverage and less reliance on corporate and income tax. So we kind of know what we need to do. We just haven't had the kind of political will and maybe not the burning platform to do it. But we do as a nation need to have a conversation, and we need to recognise what our consumer expectations are.
Peter, please go ahead.
Gabriela, we're going to pay off the debt by growing the economy, by re-energising it, but it won't be the pre-COVID economy just back on its old trajectory. It will be a restructured economy, and I agree with Gareth that there's going to be more, I wouldn't call it activist government policy. It's government policy. That's what governments are for, to have clearer long-term strategies that drive economic growth in order to produce greater prosperity, which is shared more evenly. And I think that there is an appetite now that exists not just with the Commonwealth government, but all of the states and territories that I talk to now to get more involved, not in the old sense of picking winners, which ended up being picking losers and inelegant ad hoc policy, but policy approaches which clearly will be debated, and that's a healthy thing, but are focused on more strategic objectives, and that's where the debate can be helpful. What sort of economy do we want, and how do we want to grow it? And that's a new thing, and a healthy outcome from this COVID-19 disrupted period. And talent will be at the centre of that debate. How we can create our own talent, and how we can use this global talent attraction program will be successful when it becomes a talent retention program. Mm-hmm. And that will occur when we have these critical mass in these ecosystems. So there are very clear goals there. And as somebody who has debated tax, I've been a public servant for 1 year and 7 days of my entire career. Before that, I've been in many, many tax debates. It's interesting to be on the other side. I don't think it's just about headline tax rates. Australia's corporate tax rate, 30%, top quartile, it's not good. But it's not, it's like 20.5%. And depending on which sector you're in, it's even lower. The thing is that the most elegant tax system? Is that the most efficient way to design a tax system? That's the debate.
I'm hearing very much that hopefully 2022 will be the year of reforms around tax policy, or at least an increased debate around tax policy, and hopefully even industrial policy, which, you know, we are probably well overdue a conversation on. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I honestly could have spent another hour discussing this with you guys, but I would really like to thank our participants today, Gareth, Joe, and Peter, for sharing their insights and their expertise. The poll question, was about whether or not the participants in the poll were looking for other jobs and how it's impacted their career planning. Sadly, I don't think it meets the statistical test. I'm a bit of a stats nerd, but we didn't have as many responses as I would have liked, but quite a few people are thinking about moving to another job. So, are thinking about their career planning longer term. So that's really interesting. Finally, I would like to thank the audience for their time and participation, and thank you for all of your questions. Sorry I couldn't get through all of them. There were quite a few that came in, and the conversation was so great, and there were so many things to feed off on within it that it was impossible to get those in, but thank you so much for contributing that. You can keep up to date on CEDA's program by visiting our website and register on the website for the following events. We've got Pandemic to Endemic with Professor Peter Doherty on there, and with our CEO Melinda Salento on September 13th. And we've also got Mental Health Reform with the Honourable Julia Gillard on September 23rd. Thank you so much to everyone again for joining us, and special thank you to our very esteemed panel, Joe, Peter, and Gareth. I'll see you at the next one. Thanks.